private sector will be maintained.
Someone's got to develop a product that you and I as a consumer are going to want to buy.
The country needs a comprehensive energy plan. We don't know how long this will last.
Hello and welcome to this edition of For the Record. The topic today is the election of 2012, and our guest is the executive editor of the Center Daily Times, Chip Minemyer. Chip, welcome to For the Record.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It was an unusual Tuesday, one that people are not going to forget for a long time, and I think the first thing is the amount of play or no play that Center County really was a part of this year's election.
Wasn't much of a factor. That's true. A lot of the state house local races and the state senate races were either uncontested or did not have strong challengers to the incumbents. So we didn't have that kind of role in it, and certainly none of the major national candidates came to town. Bob Casey came to our offices. It was his last stop on among newspaper endorsement trips. But other than that, no, we didn't have anybody really who spent a lot of time in Center County. No President Obama, no Mitt Romney, no wives or vice presidential candidates or any of those folks, unlike 4 years ago.
Right. We'll start at the top, talk about the presidential race. Certainly in 2008, President Obama was here, filled Old Main with students and supporters. It was a huge gathering. Of course, you weren't here in 2008.
Well, I think certainly I was aware of it, and I tell you what, I mean, it's interesting. We reported that there are more students registered to vote now than 4 years ago, but the level of energy seemed to be much lower, in my opinion. I certainly wasn't hearing the buzz either here in State College or elsewhere, and among those kind of 18 to 25, 26-year-old voters, and although they did vote, and we saw that on Tuesday, it wasn't the kind of thing where everybody was talking about it and excited about it. Less historic, certainly, than 4 years ago, but I think the energy level was not quite where it was the first time between Obama and McCain.
And certainly on the Republican side, there was much more, in my talks in the general public, a lot more enthusiasm was more, maybe it was just a vocal minority of people that were very excited about the idea of Governor Romney running against President Obama. And if you go back to Grange Fair is a perfect example of it. The Center County Republican tent was a lot of activity talking about getting people to change their voter registration. Democrats not so much. And at that point, there was a feel that Pennsylvania was in play at that point. Right. Certainly in the summer.
I think there was a perception it was in play, and even right up to the very end when the Republicans began to pour some more money and attention into Pennsylvania, but it was never really close in Pennsylvania, which was very interesting to me. And you're right. I think the Democrats were a little bit understated and reserved about their approach here in Pennsylvania, especially in Center County. Didn't hear a lot of talk. Your observations at the Grange Fair are right on the money, that the Republican tent was much more active and vibrant. And for me, what that says is, a lot of that effort, Mitt Romney did win Center County by a small margin, the slimmest of margins.
They haven't counted the absentee ballots yet, but it's 20 votes right now.
And the Republican incumbents did do well in Center County, so maybe that means that the goals were accomplished. I'm not sure how they feel about the overall result.
Well, the Romney-Ryan bus came to town. There weren't any surrogates on it.
No Romneys and no Ryans.
Actually, the Saturday prior, it wasn't really too well brought up there. There were two sons, Tag and another one of the sons came to town early that day, but it certainly didn't. It was just a meeting of supporters at the headquarters. It wasn't any big rally outside anywhere. All
of central Pennsylvania was very isolated from this election. Very interesting. Very telling.
And because of that, as the show progresses, I think we're going to talk about strategies about how campaigns have evolved, certainly. And the next case that we should talk about falls into that same thing. Senator Casey's race against Tom Smith. Tom Smith, very upfront, buying media early, even before petitions were circulated. He was buying media. That race was supposed to be close, and ultimately, he was in Pennsylvania, Center County a lot, actually brought Governor Rick Perry from Texas in a week ago. It was a unique situation there where, again, we thought, that race was in play, and in the end, about the same numbers as the president beating Mitt Romney.
And I'll be honest with you, I never thought that race was in play. And two things happened. One, I don't think Mr. Smith was his own party's choice. And that was clear in the primary. He was not endorsed by the Republican Party of Pennsylvania. Won anyway, give him credit, and didn't seem to get as much Pennsylvania support. Now, he got a lot of national money, in that race, and certainly spent a lot of it. Right. What he didn't do a lot of was visiting with people like me. He didn't come to see us. We talked to some papers across the state, did very few editorial board visits, where that's the opportunity really to kind of speak directly to the leadership of a publication, but also through them to speak to the readers and to say, here's what we think and here's what my positions are. And he chose not to do very much of that. And I think, to his own detriment, frankly. You can't really give somebody your endorsement if they've not come and sat down and talked to you. That's been my opinion forever. And I think, he did himself a disservice there. He may have had some views that were perfectly legitimate to speak about outside of, TV ads and his website. But that's really where we found out about him.
And the polls in Pennsylvania, they were all over the place. Susquehanna polling, Jimmy Lee he worked for the Republican Party, did an internal poll. That one his model was based more on a 2004 model. Other ones, Rasmussen, Gallup, were still basing theirs on the 2008. So it was a wide open, we really didn't know what we were thinking about it going into Tuesday night.
What I'm not sure that the Republicans did a real good job of leading up to the election was getting people registered to vote. And that was really a strategy of the Democrats 4 years ago, flood the polls with people who were new voters. And I'm not sure that the Republicans did as good a job of that as they could have this time around.
Do you think a lot of the news, not speaking for the CDT, but for other news sources, do you think they were doing more news about the poll that day that came out as opposed to what was going on the campaign trail?
It's a mix. And certainly when you see a poll and the numbers maybe are interesting, they're moving this direction or moving that direction, I think that's a newsworthy moment. You can't lose sight, though, of what the messages are on the stump, on the trail, and kind of get at the personalities and what they're pushing for. And it's easy to say a poll says this or a poll says that. Polls have plus or minus, they're not 100% accurate, right. Obviously. Yes. And you really need to look at, how the mechanism of the poll, what was the strategy, to whom did they talk? They talked to registered voters, they talked to people on the street, did they talk to people within a certain party, how did they break it down, age groups, demographically, all those things matter. And in terms of making a poll accurate. And sometimes the real trick is analyzing the poll. Well,
and I think that's what a lot of different people took their analysis one way or another. Dick Morris out there saying it was going to be a big, strong Romney win. He has a lot of egg on his face. He'll have to answer for that.
Right.
When we come back, let's talk about statewide races.
Absolutely.
You're watching For the Record on WHVL. Back with Chip Minemyer with more after this. Welcome back to For the Record. Our guest today, Chip Minemyer, executive editor of the Centre Daily Times. We are discussing the election of 2012, and we could call it a bad Tuesday for Republicans. And nothing says it more than the statewide races for Attorney General, Auditor General, and Treasurer, where the Democrats went 3 for 3.
I think there were no surprises necessarily in Treasurer. Certainly Rob McCord, you expected him to win. Auditor General was a toss-up all the way, and even right to the very end of the night. That was the last statewide race that was called. The Attorney General race, to me, was fascinating. A lot of people were calling this a referendum on the handling of the Jerry Sandusky case. That's why we paid considerable attention to it here, just to make sure that folks in Center County were at least aware, plugged in, and were thinking about these candidates, and depending on where they came down on that whole issue, that they were able to think for themselves and say, this is an investigation worth looking at again, or maybe they're satisfied with what happened.
Right, and if you look at the two people that were involved, Kathleen Kane, first female ever elected to the Attorney General's office now, also now the first Democrat ever elected to the race.
It was an appointed seat up until the 70s, and then now, since then, it's been an elected office, and as you just said, men and, Republicans have dominated that seat right through, and certainly this is a very telling election in that particular race.
Well, if you even go back to prior to the primary, when this all came about, David Freed, who is the Cumberland County District Attorney, put his name in. Also, Senator John Rafferty put his name in as well. There were some discussions within the Republican Party, let's put it that way, and ultimately it came down to the fact that Governor Corbett was putting his support behind Dave Freed. And as we get through this, as we talk about this race, I think that more than anything else was probably the undoing for Dave Freed against Kathleen Kane.
Well, I think, if you're a Republican candidate in Pennsylvania and the governor supports you and the governor's Republican, you say thank you. And,
yes,
you run your campaign. And I'm not sure even at that moment he realized just how controversial this whole Sandusky scenario has become across the state, not just here in Center County and down through the Harrisburg area where some of the legal maneuverings have taken place, but all across Pennsylvania. Certainly you have Penn State alumni everywhere. Yes. And you've got people who are plugged into this issue all across the state and who want to know more, I think, and want to know at what point did Corbett begin his investigation, and was it delayed as he ran for governor, and all those kinds of questions that people want to see answers to.
And as I was out on the trail this year talking to people about it, a lot of people said they're for Mitt Romney, they're for Tom Smith. They would not vote for David Freed, all based on what happened with the Sandusky case. There are a lot of questions that a lot of people have a lot of answers to. Then the week prior to the election, the indictment of President Spanier happens. Yes. So that ugly situation rears its ugly head once again and makes the focus back again to the heart of the race.
There were people who accused the Republicans of staging that indictment right before the election for their own benefit. I'm not sure it was to their benefit, though. I think it just, as you said, rekindled some of this dialogue about Sandusky and Corbett's role, and even Linda Kelly's role, and maybe as a last-minute political move by the Republicans, backfired and cost them that election on Tuesday.
And President Spanier comes right out of the gate swinging in his defense, saying this is all politically driven by the governor.
He's been doing that from the get-go, and that's been his tack from the onset. And obviously we were wondering if and when he might face charges, and you can say the timing was suspect, but he didn't react any differently than he's reacted right along.
Now the case. Right now, the case for Mr. Schultz and Mr. Curley is tentatively set for January,
right,
early January.
Yeah.
However, we were talking right before we came back from the break, that is subject to maybe changing again.
The prosecution has said they're willing to delay it, push it back further into 2013. One of the things that the Attorney General, the current Attorney General, would like to do is pair up Spanier with the other two and have it one big trial for three defendants. While it seems cumbersome to me, it seems like a complicated situation, and if I'm an attorney for any of the three, I'm saying, wait a second, my guy's going to stand on his own and either be guilty or not guilty. But I think the fact that the prosecution's open to delaying the Curley-Schultz proceedings means it's going to happen, and it'll be pushed back.
Well, with Attorney General Kaine coming in, and the schedule begins like 2 weeks after she's being sworn in, that could be part of the reason as well. And also, from a prosecutor's point of view, I'm anxious to ask somebody about this in the legal thing. If you put all three on trial at the same time, does it become let's make a deal?
It may. Certainly there's that tactic. You get one of the folks to roll on somebody else, and then there you go. And when we talked to Kathleen Kaine before the election, she didn't have that strategy mapped out, or if she did, she wasn't ready to divulge it. But I think she was eager to get in and win the race, first of all, and then get started with kind of analyzing what has happened over the course of several years in Harrisburg, pursuant to this case.
Now, did both candidates come in and meet with the editorial board?
We met personally with David Freed. Kathleen was on the trail, and Kathleen Kaine we met with through Skype, the magic of technology. And we were allowed to have that allowed us to have a discourse, a back and forth, and that was better than not talking to her at all. She was out of the area. Ironically, she came through Penn State College, 4 or 5 days later, a week later, but that would have been right up against the moment when we needed to have had our dialogue internally and publish our endorsement.
I'm anxious to see with her election what happens along with the review of the Sandusky case, along with the trial of the other Penn State officials. What other things she's going to look into across the Commonwealth? I know one of the things she was worried about was talking about the fracking situation and environmental issues.
We didn't talk much about the environmental side and fracking. We did talk a lot about victimization of children and programs in place, and ones she would like to see the state take on. And that was one area that she was very very forthcoming about. Environmental issues, perhaps, because that's obviously another area where there's been a clear line of demarcation between the Corbett administration and some of his people that have been detractors.
Looking at that race, of all the races that are out there, could anyone have beaten Kathleen Kaine, do you think, from the Republican side, being tied to Governor Corbett?
No, probably not. And that reminds me of the presidential election 4 years ago. I didn't think a Republican had a chance of winning it, frankly. And I don't know who they could have put up instead of John McCain. I thought whoever they put up was sunk, because the Bush, the vision of President Bush and his reputation had sunk to a point where it was going to be tough to be the next Republican. I kind of think here, if you're attached to the governor and on this issue and on some other issues, it's tough to overcome that. David Freed didn't say he didn't have a relationship with the governor, didn't act like they didn't know each other, never heard of Corbett, that kind of stuff. But he did try to stand on his own when we talked to him. And he had a great prosecutorial background, a lot of experience, and a sharp guy, and we liked him a lot. We ended up endorsing Kathleen Kaine in part partly because we liked her credentials as well and her kind of aggressive, in-your-face attitude, but also because she was very willing to try to dig deeper on the Sandusky side and find out what she could find out.
You're watching For the Record on WHVL. Back with more after this. Welcome back to For the Record. We're discussing election night 2012 with our guest, Chip Minemyer from the Centre Daily Times. Chip, let's talk about the local races now, the ones that really were impacted here in Centre County. Not that the president or the senator wouldn't be, but certainly Congressman Glenn Thompson against his opponent, Charles Dumas. That was an interesting race because of, again, the size of the 5th Congressional District.
It's an enormous district. One of the largest east of the Mississippi, stretches from the center region here, State College area, the whole way up to the northwest to the New York border and to Erie. And if you get a place that's that big, a lot of different viewpoints, a diverse electorate, and it's a challenge for candidates. 2 of them, both from Centre County, trying to reach out to all those folks across that wide swath of Pennsylvania. It
was interesting that Charles Dumas, I just learned about him this year, relatively a newcomer to the political scene, I guess, but very well spoken in everything that I saw him at politically.
He had some political background. He had run for office, I believe, in New York State, early in his career, and had been involved in get out the vote campaigns and different things like that. I mean, so he wasn't a complete newcomer to the political scene. He was here, and a Penn State theater professor is not something you often see step across into the political realm, but he certainly was a bright guy, very charismatic, very compelling, and brought an interesting approach to this campaign.
I had the opportunity to be at a televised debate between the 2 gentlemen. Very well spoken and very well supported in that room. A lot of the same views as President Obama. So they're an interesting dynamic that, you have Congressman Thompson, who one of the things that he was accused of was being the standard bearer for the Republican Party. And then you have his opponent pretty much following, it was almost a straight down the line Republican versus Democrat.
And we were critical of both of those candidates for not being more locally focused, to be perfectly honest with you. If anybody saw our endorsement, we didn't endorse either one of them. We were critical of Congressman Thompson, presuming he would win, which he did,
yes,
and saying, look, please step away from the national party agenda and let's be more locally focused. And with candidate Dumas, similarly, it felt like he was campaigning for Obama, not necessarily for himself.
Right.
And he may have brought some great perspectives and ideas to the race. We just didn't hear a lot of it. If you looked at his website, there wasn't a long platform list, and I will do this and I will push for that. Right. It was much more national agenda, pushing to see that the president was reelected and those kinds of things. So that was, for me and for our editorial board, a disappointment in that race.
You mentioned the editorial board. Who always is a part of that? And how do you go about the process of endorsing a candidate through the newspaper?
We have 4 members of the editorial board at this time, and they're all, it's the publisher and then myself and 2 more folks from the newsroom, Allison Boston and Chris Rosenblum, who are veterans and have been around. And what we do in each case is we invite the candidates to come to see us, close the door, and try to ask a lot of the tough questions, get into the realm of what they would do if in office or what they will do next term if they're reelected and those kinds of things. Try to get a sense of both their ideology and their personality, both of which I think are important. And then, once they're gone or another session, really kind of, what do our notes say? How do you feel? How do I feel? What do we think is the right thing for the district and for the communities that we represent as a newspaper? And then that's how we made our decisions. And the risk is, that you'll anger a percentage of your readership, invariably. Certainly the presidential endorsement did, and the congressional endorsement did. But you have to be honest. If you're going to do it, do it. And be honest and put out your views and let people digest them. And we put out, prior to any of the endorsements, running an editorial saying, look, we're going to do this. Here's why. We think it's important. And you can take our opinion or leave it. Ultimately, you could either say they're right, they're wrong, or not care. But we hope what people did was read it, think about it, process it, and then go to the polls in a more informed fashion. It's interesting seeing, the waxing and waning of endorsements by newspapers. Most media don't do it. Newspapers used to all do it, and now it's maybe half. And in my company, about half the papers in McClatchy did it. And and their reasonings are sound either way. Because you say, well, people know a lot. They can go online and read about candidates, but they can't really get filtered information. It's all, this party said this and this party said that. And I think that's a risk. And what we try to do is analyze it and then bring it back out in a thoughtful way.
And let's talk about 2 of the House races, Pennsylvania General Assembly. When I say House, people that you also talked about, certainly Representative Scott Conklin and Representative Kerry Benninghoff, which I believe both were endorsed by the paper.
They both were. They're veteran lawmakers, and in both cases they had interesting challengers, and You know, I think that's what you really need to have to create a dialogue in an election. Mike Hanna was unopposed and won, you know, re-election in his district, and whether he was, you know, deserved to be re-elected is not really the question for me. It'd be nice to have somebody in there debating issues and talking about it and bringing a different perspective to the race, so that you force the candidate to describe what he or she will do. And that's why I think you need to have competent challengers. And I think in both the Benninghoff and Conklin race, you had people who raised issues about the candidate, about their voting records, and about their perspectives, and at least gave you an opportunity to think about it.
And one of the things that, one of the dynamics about the state seats, Senate and House, it's still up in the air what areas they're going to cover.
Sure, absolutely. Well, you know, obviously coming out of the 2010 census, there was the redistricting plan resurfaced, and they were able to pull off the congressional redistricting, and that's a whole different animal if you follow any Western Pennsylvania politics.
Right.
Republicans got what they wanted. They knocked off 2 sitting Democratic congressmen.
The only bright
one in the
nights
spring
for the
and one
Republicans.
one in the spring and one this past Tuesday. So that mission was accomplished.
Right.
The state redistricting will be reopened now, presumably early in 2013. And, you know, it was interesting. We talked to Ron Reese, who was running against Scott Conklin. If the redistricting goes through as originally proposed, he would not even be living in his own district anymore had he won the election. So it's very interesting watching that happen. It's you know, political horse trading. You swap this little precinct for that precinct and try to give the controlling party the most House seats it can get, or Senate seats. And that's really what it's all about. And Conklin had an interesting idea when we sat down and talked to him. Said, take all this data, throw it into a computer, and let it suggest your districts for you so that they're relatively balanced. And I think that would be a very, it's not going to happen.
Sure.
But it'll be interesting. But then you might get some districts where it's not clearly Democrat or Republican, and you might actually have to talk about some issues. You know, you wouldn't have the voter support to just get reelected.
Now, really quick, next year, Center County, we have a district attorney race that needs to be discussed really quick. Stacey Parks Miller, our first elected Democratic DA, she's going to stand for re-election. Have you heard any names that might be running against her?
Have not been way too plugged into some of the ongoing, you know, the elections that played out on Tuesday. I'm sure we'll start to hear them, you know, bubble up here pretty quickly, because, you know, next thing you know, we'll be getting nomination petitions circulating. We'll be off to the races for next year.
That's exactly right. It stops one day, we go to the next year,
And if it's a presidential election, you know, the day President Obama was celebrating re-election.
Thanks for stopping by.
Sure.
You've been watching For the Record at WHVL. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.